Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome, I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today is the author of Scattered Lights, a collection of short stories that was a finalist for the 2021 PEN Faulkner Award in Fiction. He also has written 3 historical novels, The Language of Trees, This Old World, and Slant of Light. The 4th novel in that series will be coming out in 2023. My guest grew up in the Missouri Ozarks, where most of his fiction is set, and worked there as a newspaper reporter before entering the field of higher education. He taught journalism, English, and communication for a number of colleges and universities during his career, but is now retired from teaching and writes full-time. The son of a rural librarian, he was most proud this year when he received the Missouri Author Award from the Missouri Library Association. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Steve Wiegenstein.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Thank you, Steve. And our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, so what took you so long to write a book?
Well, of course, I was working full-time, and that's the standard excuse, I'm sure. But all the while that I was working, I was writing short stories. So even though the story collection didn't come out until November of 2020, it had been building for literally decades. As I would write a story, publish it, I always try to keep my hand in on writing, even as I was working. So my first book was actually a novel, which did take a long time, really, because not to sound silly about it, but I just didn't feel quite ready to do it until I had what I thought was a really irresistible idea, and then enough free time to get to work on it. So everything happens in its own time, I suppose, and certainly with this collection, it's something that's really developed over a long, long, long time.
Tell us about the difference in writing short stories and novels, not just the length, but how do you wrap your head around those different formats?
Well, they really are different stylistically, and you have to approach them in a different way. Because with a short story, you're aiming for a really concentrated effect, and you don't have time to mess around. You got to get right to your essential elements and set up characters very, very quickly. So it's kind of like doing fine work. If you're doing needlepoint or something, you have to pay attention to every tiny thing. I kind of enjoy writing short stories for that reason, because if you get a good idea, you can knock one out in a week's time. At least the better part of it anyway, and that's pretty satisfying, as you can imagine. With a novel, you're in for the long haul, and you have to, in my experience anyway, you have to pace yourself, because you can't write it in a hurry. You have to settle in and sort of figure things out as you go. So it's much more kind of a long-term job, and you have to approach it with that kind of discipline. you really have to discipline yourself to write a novel. Whereas with a short story, you can wait for inspiration to strike. But it doesn't work when you're a novel writer. You have to kind of give inspiration a push.
Well, years ago, we were told that short story collections were a harder sell, but now that's not the case anymore, is it?
No, it's not. And I think they kind of ebb and flow. Um, Certainly, in the case of my collection, I got a lot more recognition than I ever imagined I would for it. I was just happy to see them published in book form. It's like, oh gosh, these stories, some of which had been published, in the 1990s, were seeing a sort of second life, and I was quite thrilled about that. But then when it, got some recognition and was starting to gather awards and selling books, I thought, well, this is just icing on the cake for me. And there have been quite a few really nice story collections that have come out lately that are just really rewarding. So maybe the genre is back in flower for a while again.
I think so. The library in my Mississippi hometown is named for my mother. So I understand why you were so happy to receive such a prestigious award from the State Library Association. They're a tough audience, and you did it.
You can't snooker a library.
No,
They read too many books.
I
Yeah,
know. That's what makes that award so precious, I'm sure.
it was. It was a really a moment of pride, and the library in my hometown is named after my mom too, because she founded it or was instrumental in founding it. So they named it after her once it is in its new building. Um, and when they dedicated that library, my brother had some little buttons made with her photograph on it, and it was kind of a slogan. And so I wore that to the conference of the Library Association, just as a kind of reminder. And it was a very proud moment for me and hopefully for her.
That's very special. Once
So,
you wrote your first book, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent? Did you decide to choose a hybrid, a small press, or did you self publish?
like a lot of first-time authors, um, I was not very well informed about the whole publishing process. So I probably wasted a good 8 to 12 months searching for an agent, um, which was a fruitless search. Um, and finally found it was kind of one of those stories where I finally did find an agent who said, I liked your material because it was a historical novel. And she said, but you need to really go epic with this. Make it one of those big historical novels that people love to read. And so I thought, well, okay, I can do that. So we boosted it up by about 30,000 words and, stretched it and made it epic, so to speak. Uh, and then she said, "Oh, it doesn't really quite do it either." And we parted ways. So then I went back on the search again, started going to conferences where I was able to meet personally with not just agents, but also editors and acquisition editors and publishers. Um, had a wonderful conversation with a small press publisher who did indeed end up publishing it. So when I sent them the manuscript, they said, "Oh, we really like this, but it's too long." So I took out 34,000 words, except they weren't the same 30,000 that I put in the first time. So it was a torturous process. But honestly, it was one of those things where, after all was said and done, it ended up being a lot better book than it was at the beginning. So I don't regret having what looked like wasted a year or a year and a half through that process, because the end result was I think substantially improved. So all was to the good as far as I was concerned. And I've stayed with that press ever since.
What about the editing process for you during that time? Was there a lot that ended up on the cutting room floor? I know you tightened it up, but were there specific things that you really wanted to be in the book that ended up on the cutting room floor?
The only thing, well, a couple of things. One is I generally kind of trust my own judgment when it comes to editing. And the one thing that I take out myself is, I think, the great pitfall of a lot of historical writers, which is the research. Um, you probably had this experience yourself reading a book, and you come to this big information dump of a page and a half or 2 pages, where one character turns to the other and says, "As you know, Bob, the the use of steel in sword making goes back to the 1400s," and you can see that the author has done all this research and is just determined to put it in there, by golly. And so I've tried to be pretty rigorous with that, of cutting out my own, where I'm showing my research a little too much. The the editor I worked with at Amphora Publishing, uh, it was a really interesting experience because, as she told me once, writing is an art, but publishing is a business. And so she was thinking about it from a business perspective. And my own instinct is to be kind of a little, I guess, withdrawn or just austere, I guess, in my writing. And she was much more emotional. So we had a lot of back and forth, particularly with the first book, where she would send me a note and say, "I need to be crying at the end of this chapter, and I am not crying." And so I would get to work, and turn up the emotional volume a little bit past my own comfort level. And then she would write back and say, "Still not crying." So I finally was able to make her cry on about the fourth or fifth effort. And it wasn't so much taking out as it was, thinking more deeply about what was going through the characters' minds and characters' hearts, and trying to identify with them. So the editing process for me was a really informative kind of experience. And they edited the first book really hard. But after that, I've kind of sort of figured out what they were thinking about. It's not that I'm trying to meet their needs. More is like, I understand where they're coming from and I respect that. So as the books have gone by, they've been edited less and less over the years, because I'm just kind of instinctively figuring out where I need to go better than I did when I started. Thank goodness.
Well, you became quite prolific after your first book. You've got several under your belt now.
That's right. And the historical novels are kind of a series. They're not they're independent books, but they're set in the same location, and they keep the same cast of characters through time. So the first book is set in the 1850s and 60s, the Civil War years, or leading into the Civil War. And the main character there, she's 25 at that point. So then by the third book, it's set in the 1880s, and now she's in her mid-50s. So it's been really a fun thing for me, and a kind of challenge for me to take the character and mature them as time would naturally do, and as experience would do, and yet to keep the character consistent from one to another. I've had people who've read one book, say the last book, and wrote me about it, and they said, "Do you have any other books?" And so I'd send them, links to the early ones, and they said, "Oh, I had no idea," which is what you're hoping for in this kind of series, in that people don't have to read them in order or even read them all at once or anything like that. So yeah.
That's nice because I never seem to find anyone's first book. So I like it when they're standalone and I can jump in at any time.
Yeah, it's true. So luckily, all three of them are still in print so far. So so far so good anyway.
Since you're writing full time now, what's your writing routine? Are you a morning person or a night person?
I'm very much a morning person. Um, I love getting up before dawn, before everybody else, and sitting down to write. Um, I don't know exactly why. I kind of have a sense that maybe it's because we tend to wake up out of dreams, that many people have this experience that the thing that wakes them up in the morning is a vivid dream of something, and they find themselves waking up. But I find that for me anyway, I'm in a really good mental state right then. Put the coffee on, open up the laptop, and start to write. Um, it's to me, it's really, and sitting in the dark is kind of productive, because external influences are shut out, and uh, I know it's time to get on with my day when I start to hear the birds sing.
That sounds really nice, but that's not me. I wander around like a vampire in the night all night, and then I want to sleep in.
Gotta go with what works.
Did real people inspire any of your characters?
Not really. My the main character in the novel series is a woman, and I was fortunate through my childhood and adult years really to have grown up among and lived with several really intelligent, strong women who influenced me a lot, starting with my own mother, but other family members, grandparents, aunts, and then friends and loved ones. So I'm sure there's pieces of all of them that go into that main character. Um, but I can't really point to any specific individual who's been the inspiration for any of the characters. The novels take place in what starts out as a utopian community, and I did model the community on a real life 19th century utopia, just to have a kind of a framework to hang it on. But beyond that, it's pretty much all made up.
Well, tell us a little bit about the book you've brought to read a section for us today, and so that we can hear your tone and voice in the book.
This is Scattered Lights. Uh, it's the story collection, and I started work in short fiction when I was, oh gosh, in my 20s, taking a few stabs at short stories in later college years. Um, didn't really start to feel confident in the craft until 5 or so years later. But through the years, as I said earlier, I've always tried to keep a story going, even when there were other things happening. So at a couple of years ago, I got the idea that it was time to try to collect these stories, and some of them go back all the way actually to the 1980s. There's one or two stories here that were first published in the 1980s, and then others which were written specifically for the collection. Um, I had a different publisher, one who was really interested in these short stories, and when I sent them to him, he said, "These are great, but it needs a little more heft. Could you write me some more?" And so I thought, okay, write on command, which is something I'd really never done, but it turned out quite well. So they range in a time period, of about 30 years. But I'm happy in that, honestly, I don't think people can tell which ones were written first and which ones were written most recent. The story I'll read to you, or the opening of it, is a story called Signs and Wonders. And I have a couple of stories in here that involve the same character, whose name is Larry. And Larry is what a lot of people would describe as a religious fanatic, kind of out there on the fringes. But he's also a very sweet and thoughtful man. And so one of my challenges in writing Larry was to write it in such a way that people couldn't, there was no way to condescend toward him the way people do, where they see somebody who seems kind of nutty to them, and it's really easy to kind of dismiss them as, oh, just, nutcases and things like that. So I really wanted to capture the essence of him, even as he is kind of embarrassing his friends with his proselytizing and things like that. So it was kind of a challenge I set for myself. So anyway, let me just read you the first few paragraphs of Signs and Wonders. The morning fog from the river came up the hollow slow, and it was slow to burn away. Larry and the other men walked through the wet grass to tend the livestock, while the women cooked bacon and eggs in the big skillets someone had borrowed from a church camp. Unidentifiable birds sang. Larry had never been around livestock. In the old world, he had managed the produce department at the Shop and Save. So he drew shovel duty, as they called it, avoiding any rough language. They worked quietly in the wet air. It was time to butcher another steer. The men who knew what they were doing picked one out and drove it into the holding chute. At the crack of the 22, Larry barely looked up from his work. The birds paused and then continued. Larry didn't mind shovel duty. The labor had a quiet mindfulness to it, work as prayer. It gave him the right attitude. The idea in these days was to be low to the ground. When the morning chores were done, they filed back to the camp, or what passed for a camp. A hodgepodge of tents and trailers clustered around a large open-air shelter, which served as cafeteria and meeting house. Brother Moore's tent was at one end of the shelter. As they walked by, they could see him through the open flap, sitting at a card table, scribbling in a notebook, ignoring their presence, his heavy body hunched over his Schofield reference Bible. Even at that hour, he wore a white shirt and black tie. Brother Moore insisted on appearances. And that's how that story begins.
Very nice.
Thank you. Thank you.
You mentioned that Larry was in a few of the stories. Is there any common thread running through all the stories as far as theme, or are they entirely different?
Well, I didn't notice it until I actually collected them because they were written individually and over a great span of time. But it was kind of interesting when I put them all together in one place. I did notice a lot of the characters are, for want of a better word, stuck. They need to make a decision, or they're in a spot where they feel pressured or discomfort, and they need to do something, but they can't quite bring themselves to make that decision. And so in story after story, a lot of the time, the characters are trying to move from a point of uncomfortable stasis to something that they either do or don't succeed at doing. And some of the characters fail, others try and they do the wrong thing. But they almost always seem to kind of, they start out and they've got some kind of problem that they just can't quite solve. And they're trying to figure out how to solve that problem. I had no idea that I kept writing that theme. I don't know what it means, but there it is. So well, I'll let people do with that what they will.
What about publicity? We writers want to write. We don't want to promote ourselves. Have you found anything that worked or maybe that didn't work?
For me anyway, my most successful form of publicity has been making dates at libraries, particularly with the novel series. Since I'm doing historical writing, I come across really interesting things during the period that I'm writing, and I almost always can work those things up into a talk about something. So what it ends up being is, I can generate an interesting talk about a topic that I can then go around to libraries and tell them about. For example, the third book in the series takes place during what was the first big timber boom in the Missouri Ozarks, when companies came in from the east and essentially just, harvested every tree they could lay hands on and really made it kind of a mess of things. And that's a really an interesting historical period, and folks like to hear about that. They don't necessarily want to hear me read for an hour or 45 minutes, but they love to hear about interesting subjects. And after that, but folks always have something they want to talk about. They want to tell me their own experiences, and we get into conversations. And I have found that to be a really successful way of publicizing my own work and just learning from people, and that's been a great part of the experience as well. As I never come away from a library talk without feeling like I've been educated too, and that's a nice feeling.
That's a great idea. What do you think was the best money you've ever spent as a writer?
I have to say the best money I ever spent was to go down to the Pulpwood Queens annual girlfriend weekend in Jefferson, Texas. When was that? 2017, I think maybe. I went down there, and I live in Missouri, and so it was a bit of a trip. I had to spend money to get down there. The whole thing cost some money, but I met number one, just a huge body of really enthusiastic readers, book clubs who love to read, and of course they're mostly located in the South and Southwest, but not completely. They're all over. So just being in a conference room with a couple of hundred excited readers is a really fun experience. And of course, then I got to talk to some of the book clubs over the years, and probably 50 really interesting writers, some of whom we're still in touch with each other. We have a lot to talk about. We stay in touch on Facebook or other ways. So when I think about that experience, it has led me, I don't know whether it's made money for me, but it's certainly been one of the most rewarding experiences that I've ever done. And sure, it cost some money, but it was well worth it.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm a member of the Pulpwood Queens, and I'm going to attend my first weekend in January in Amelia Island, Florida. So I'm excited and looking forward to it.
Exciting. I missed during the pandemic, and I'm going to miss this year because I don't have anything new to bring out to folks. But when 2023 rolls around and I have a new book to promote, you can pretty well bet that I'll be there with my Timber Guys shirt on.
That's great. My first book, No Names to Be Given, was chosen as the September book of the month. So I'm excited.
Wonderful. Wonderful. It's a great experience.
Steve, always our last interview question is about our unique writers over the age of 50. Do you have any advice for writers 50 and above?
I sure do. I've been thinking about that. It's come up a couple of times before in conversation. And this is going to sound counterintuitive. But to me, the best thing you can do is be patient. because there's this irresistible urge, particularly if you've gotten something finished. It's like, I got to get this thing out the door. I got to find an agent or a publisher right now. You know, the clock is ticking. I need to get this thing on the move. And sometimes in my experience, the best thing you can do is let that manuscript sit for a couple of months, not even look at it, but then pick it up 6 weeks later and reread it and think about it again, because that has happened to me. And that I wrote something, I thought it was great, I typed the end, and then for whatever reason, I didn't, fool with it. And then a month or two later, I picked it up and I thought, oh, you know what? This isn't quite ready yet. This omelet is not quite cooked, and I need to run through it one more time. So the main thing I would advise is don't rush yourself. Feel patient. Take your time, and that was my own experience with querying agents. I really jumped in there too soon on that the first time around. There's, a book is going to find its audience. It will eventually find its audience. You have to have faith in yourself that it will, and to resist that urge to just get it out as quickly as you can, because sometimes that's not the best thing to do.
I think that is great advice. And I just appreciate you so much being with us here today. And we are excited to now say that you're one of our authors over 50.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday, when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend, and check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing, and remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.